Hey everyone, welcome to the Resilient Body Program. My name is Alex Effer, and I want to welcome you to the Resilient Body series community. Now, what I wanted to do today is discuss a little bit about the framework that we've put together for the lower body program. And it's going to be very similar to the principles and the phases that we've used in the upper body. And I wanted to mirror that in the lower body from an intentional standpoint, just because of the fact that when we start to look at different phases of gait, different phases of breathing, how the pelvis, how the rib cage moves, we see there's a lot of similarities between them. And because of that, what I want to do is outline some of the underlying mechanics of the body that we are going to be improving phase by phase. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the assessments that we're going to use in order to allow you to move on to each phase. It's not necessarily allow you to, but recommended that we, in each phase, we're improving specific aspects of the pelvis, of the knee, of the foot, or increasing the mobility of those areas so that each phase can be compounded on the next. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to dive deep into some of the underlying mechanics. And what I wanted to do also was show you how we can mirror these two programs together to create a full resilient body. So just quickly, we're going to go over a little bit of the learning objectives. So one of my main fundamental principles on how I view the body is through gait. Now, gait has three different phases. They each require different movements of the body, of the foot, of the knee, of the pelvis, all the way up the chain to the upper body. And what I want to do is show you how gait interacts with the pelvis and the foot. We're then going to go over some of the hip flexion arc of motion, very similar to the shoulder flexion, but in a different area in the pelvis, to show you how we can take that area, take the pelvis, divide it into three different sections so that we can make sure that we're selecting the right exercises at the right time. And more importantly, understanding why we are doing these things. We've had a lot of coaches and therapists come through this program as a learning opportunity to understand how to program these exercises based on principles in a sequential manner. We've also had a lot of coaches and therapists use this system with their clients with a lot of success. And so what I wanted to do is provide the lower body aspect. I personally have used this framework with all of my clients, from chronic pain, chronic illness like stroke, MS, to different degrees, of course, as well as with professional athletes, because this system is universal. These are based on principles. And if we use principles, then we can alter the variables in order to create a more integrated system, in order to understand what our assessment is telling us. And so with this presentation, I really wanted to outline how we are using the mechanics to dictate what's happening in the assessment so that we can provide the right exercise selection. And that's why we're going to go over the different mobility or the assessment checkpoints, which is at the end of each phase and even at the beginning of the phases, you are going to assess yourself using hip flexion and straight leg raise, two of my favorite measurements for the lower body to determine what's happening in the pelvis. And with that, that is going to be an indication of, can we progress to the next phase? Because each phase is going to be based on certain measurements through those assessments. And then we're going to talk about how you progress through the Resilient Lower Body program so you get the most efficient or most effective results. So let's start with a little bit of gait, just a little bit of gait 101. We're not going to go super in depth. We go really in depth in the Evolve mentorship. But with this is just, it provides you a little bit of a framework or an overview of gait. So why I like to focus on gait, as I mentioned, it is a fundamental principle for survival. There are two things that we need to do in order to survive. That is breathing and that is moving, or gait. Way back when, our ancestors used gait, or they used walking as a way in order to traverse the plains, in order to hunt for their food. And so with that, we've evolved to use gait, and we've used gait in order to progress us forward. Gait is a forward moving motion. It allows us to get from one space to the next. And with that, each different phase of gait has a change of the foot structure, of the pelvis structure, because what we need to do is we need to absorb ground reaction forces. As soon as our foot hits the ground, we then have to absorb that force. And by doing so, we have to change our joint position, our muscle activity, in order to be able to absorb those forces and then redistribute those forces into the tendons to allow us to propel ourselves forward. So what it is, it's a dynamic progression of our center of mass. Now, what I mean by that is, as I said, it is a forward motion. We are moving forward. And with each phase, we have different progressions of our center of gravity. Our center of mass progressively moves forward with each phase in order to allow us to move. If we look at this picture in the bottom, we can see how that progression of pressure and center of gravity moves through our foot. And each different phase, we require different pressures going through our foot, which is going to require different muscle activity, different structures of our foot in order to absorb force and produce force. Absorption to allow us to make sure that all the force coming from the ground is not going to specific areas or not going just to the bone, but able to be distributed over greatest area. To me, that is the best description of mobility. It's the way that I think about mobility, is our ability to dissipate force or translate or distribute force over a greater area so that in one area it doesn't get constantly compressed or constant pressure going through that area. So as I mentioned, we want to look at gait as a progression of our center of mass. So if we look at this arrow here, we can see how, if we're looking at the shin progresses forward. And what I like to do is I like to look at the shin as an indication of where our center of mass is. So in this first phase here, we can see how the tibia or the shin bone is behind the laces of the foot. So this is an indication of our center of mass being behind the foot. Okay. As we move forward, so we hit the heel, we hit the outside of the heel as we contact the ground during heel strike. As we move into the later phase of heel strike, or as I mentioned here, an early flat foot or an early propulsive phase, that is when the first met head comes in contact with the ground. That creates an arch in our foot. So we've got a shin behind us. We've got a little bit of an arch because we've got a heel that's on the ground and we've got a ball, the big toe, or the first met head on the ground. Now, what we can also see is because the shin is still behind us, we have this open space here in the front of the ankle. This open space allows us to move forward. This is what provides us with ankle flexion. If this space is closed, we are not going to be able to move our center of gravity forward. Or sorry, we're not going to be able to flex our ankle because our center of gravity is already too forward. We're already there. We can't create more space there. So that's why I'm looking at the shin angle as an important marker as to where our center of mass is. It's easy to see that motion throughout a split squat, for example, or a lunge where our knee goes forward towards our toes. That's an indication of our center of mass going forward. And it's an important marker that I use throughout the Resilient program in order to differentiate the phase of gait that we are biasing. Because remember, each phase has different structure changes. So for example, heel strike is more supination, has a different structure change compared to when I go into mid stance and pronation, where now this midfoot comes towards the ground. And that is going to change what's happening at the knee and change what's happening at the pelvis. And when that happens, we then get changes or altering of the muscle function. Okay, so we've got three phases. We've got this heel strike where the shin is behind us. Then we move forward into mid stance. Now think of our tibia is at 90 degrees with our foot. Okay, so it's right underneath our hip. This is when hip extension starts. when the foot is right underneath us. So we've got this pronation, this mid stance. This is going to be more internal rotation bias. Then what happens is we hit a point where we cannot flex our ankle anymore. So our heel starts to lift. But an important aspect of this toe off or the heel lifting is the other leg is swinging in the air. So in this case here, what we can see is we can see the left foot is on the ground. The right leg is swinging up in the air. That creates momentum. That momentum allows us to not use a lot of muscle activity in a concentric manner to push us forward, but instead keeps the muscles, for example, like the calf, in more of an isometric contraction position to allow the tendon to be able to use the elastic energy, like an elastic band, to push us forward. Otherwise, if we're using muscles, which is very inefficient and very metabolically rich, like we have to use a lot of energy in order to do that, that's when we start to create overuse injuries or muscle strains because we cannot manage the amount of forces coming at those tissues from the ground. Okay, so we've got heel strike. That's a shin that's behind. That's a higher arch. Then we've got mid stance, which is more pronation. Then after that, we lift up the heel and go towards our toe. We'll go toe off, which are the heel lifts, and the balls of the big toes, the metatarsal heads, are in contact with the ground in order to propel us forward. If for some reason we skip over one of these phases, so for example, I'm landing in not a heel strike, but more of a pronation, then what's going to happen is now I'm not going to be able to extend my big toe efficiently because I've skipped steps. I'm not going to be able to propel off of that big toe and get big toe extension. So I'm going to do some compensations by rolling off one side, by driving the knee out or driving the knee excessively in. And so that is why through this program, we are going through each phase as if we were going through a gait sequence. And we have manipulated exercises based on that. So now if we take a step, I'm going to be moving my screen around a little bit just so you can see me a little bit, but also be able to see, because I'm going to be showing some of the structures, but also be able to see some of the text. So now we looked at the foot. We identified that we've got a supinated foot, which is the arch is lifting up. We go more on the outside of the foot. We've got a pronated foot, which is the foot is going more on the inside, and that is to allow us to absorb force so that the tendons can be able to stretch so that it can propel us forward towards toe off. But just like the foot, and that's the cool thing about the body, is that from an evolutionary standpoint, it's more efficient to be able to use something that has worked and repeat it throughout the body. So when we look at the pelvis and the foot, we can see a lot of similarities. Again, I'm not going to go into super in depth with all the similarities. There's a lot of that information in the Evolve Mentorship. But what this is doing is this provides you a little bit of context as to how we can manipulate the heel, or when we're looking at the heel, how we can see the shape of the pelvis. So, for example, the heel is very similar in its representation to the sit bone. Okay, so when I go into a heel strike position, my heel has to invert. It has to tuck inwards like that. That is going to create more of an external rotation of my foot if we talk about it globally. That is also going to create external rotation all the way up towards my pelvis. So if that calcaneus or the heel bone goes in, the sit bone will also go more inwards. So I invert the sit bone. So now I can look at the heel and say, okay, well, I know what's happening here. I know that this sit bone is also going inwards. And because the shin is back, that is going to be very similar. So if I do this, you can see how this distal part of the tibia goes forwards and this this upper part is going backwards. That's going to be very similar to the sacrum as well, where if my heel comes in or my sit bone comes in, my sacrum will counter nutate. And so you can see I push forward with lower glutes, the gemellis, obturator internus. These structures are going to bring these two together. So I get this counter nutation and I get the upper part of the tibia to come back, or the lumbar spine to tilt back. That allows for external rotation to happen. Once I move into mid stance, I then create more of an everted calcaneus, which is turning outwards. That is going to be very similar to a eversion at the sit bone. So what this does is this provides me with more internal rotation because I'm anteverted. The top of the pelvis closes because the glute med compresses up top. That shoots out the lower part of my pelvis, which is important for force production, force absorption, as well as nutating the sacrum to allow me to hinge more effectively. So I get more internal rotation at the hips versus this counter nutation, which will retrovert or turn the sockets backwards. So I have more of an external rotation bias. So we can see how these two structures are integrating with each other and how the pelvis is not much different than the foot, although they look differently and although they manage different kinds of forces. We have similar changes at the pelvis as we do at the foot, to a smaller degree, of course. When I'm doing this, this is not how much motion the pelvis has. If it does, there's a real problem. It's millimeters that we're talking about. But the muscle contractility change, depending on the shape or depending on the forces, that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about how those muscles will squeeze or compress certain areas of the pelvis to change the shape in order to distribute forces more effectively. So therefore, we can conclude that the shape of the pelvis is going to dictate the contractility and the of the muscles, and the muscles help position the joint to allow us to dissipate those forces. So there is a interdependent and dependent relationship between them. So just to recap, when we're in heel strike, we've got more of an inverted calcaneus. We have more external rotation bias all the way up the chain. So that external rotation is going to provide us with some mobility to start with. Then we move into mid stance. That mid stance is going to internally rotate the foot, pronate the foot, and create an internal rotation wave or transmission all the way up towards the pelvis and higher, of course, but we're going to just cut off at the pelvis because we're talking about the lower body. The upper body program talks a little bit about the upper body. Then that sit bone will turn out, it will open up, and that allows us to lift up our pelvic floor. That allows us to create force, and then also provides us into a position where we can absorb force as well. And what I mean by absorb force is once I hit the early part of heel strike and I go just to the first phase of mid stance, this is when I'm absorbing force. Once I get towards the end of mid stance phase where my heel is just about to lift up, that's when I'm producing force. I'm progressing my center of gravity forward. Okay. And so with this pelvis and foot as it relates to gait, it's also important, as I mentioned, to talk about how we are moving our center of mass forward. So once I'm in heel strike, my center of mass is behind me. My pelvis is behind my foot. As I move towards mid stance, I'm going to move my pelvis forward so that it's directly in line with my femur, with my tibia, with my foot. Then I'm going to go into a later mid stance where my pelvis starts to go a little bit more forward, because now we've got that forward shin. The shin angle is going forward. Then after that, we go into toe off, and that's where our pelvis is the most forward, but it externally rotates, but to a greater degree in order to allow us to compress the pelvis to a state to which we can extend off of that big toe. I'm throwing a lot of information at you. And of course, this could be new, or this could be a different perspective, but it's going to be important for this program. Now, for some of you who don't care about the biomechanical aspect of things, that's totally okay. You don't necessarily have to know this stuff in order to do the program, because the program is going to, I've set it up so it's going to help you no matter what, if you understand or you don't understand. But for those who want to understand how I put this together, why I put this together, this is why I'm explaining this. So I go ER, heel strike, IR, mid stance. We then re-ER to go toe off. So we supinate the foot again, create a rigid foot to allow us to propel off that big toe. So now let's talk a little bit about our hip arc for exercise selection. Now, what we're doing is we are taking all this information that we know about gait, about the pelvis, and about the knee, because really the knee is just an integration of the pelvis and the foot. So we've got the tibia from the foot, the femur from the pelvis, and they create this joint. Although they are not touching, they are separated and they allow for rotation. That's how we move. That's how we bend. That's how we progress our center of gravity forward. But what I want to do is I want to take this movement and dissect it into the 3 different phases of gait, because that provides us with a framework to understand what is going on at the pelvis. Because remember, each phase of gait has different influences at the foot and the pelvis. And so with that, we can logically conclude that we can have some similarities through the flexion. We also have research that indicates that at different parts of our hip flexion, we have different contractility biases of the muscles. So for example, when I'm at 60 degrees of hip flexion, plus or minus 10, the glute medius, which can be an external rotator when the hip is extended, but in a hip flex position, it becomes an internal rotator. The piriformis, which is an external rotator, gains leverage as an internal rotator at 90 degrees. That's why the classic pigeon stretch, which you'll see in the program, actually helps improve or open up the posterior part of the hip. Because remember, we get nutation back here if we internally rotate, and the piriformis tries to bring these 2 structures together. So we can open up the back of the hip by making sure the piriformis is in a position to not bias external rotation. We've also got glute max that becomes an internal rotator, especially at the lower part of the pelvis. So this is how this hip flexion becomes so valuable, because we can determine that depending on where people are, we can categorize them based on the phase of gait, and then we can categorize the exercise that we may be selecting depending on their assessment. So at 0 to 60, this is when we mentioned how toe off is the max compression happening at the pelvis to limit motion so that we can propel off that big toe. So we can hinge off the big toe. If we have too much motion at the pelvis or the back, lower back, for example, we cannot effectively push off that big toe. We're going to roll on the inside. We're going to roll on the outside. We're going to do all these different things in order to progress our center of gravity forward. But because we don't have a locked system above, we're going to have some vulnerabilities and we're going to have some energy leaks. It's another way to say that. So for me, 0 to 60 degrees, that is somebody who is very limited, who is biased towards toe off, and we have some compression going on the back of the hip. So we've got somebody, again, who's very much like this, got compression in the back of the hip, so they don't have much, and the pelvis is forward, so we don't have much ability to flex the hip. Then move into the second phase of gait, mid stance, so 60 to 20. And why 60 to 20? Well, as we discussed in the upper body program, the scapula upwardly rotates only between 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, because the scapula will only move 60 degrees during that movement. And inside of the hip, physiologically speaking, we only have 120 degrees of hip flexion. That's it. After that, we have to rely on the lumbar spine to rotate to provide us with that movement. So at 60 to 120, that is our mid stance. That is when these muscles become more IR biased. This is when we can create more internal rotation of the hip. This is when the innominates close, when the sacrum nutates. So we've got the anterior glute medius. We've got all these external rotators that reduce its tone or its tension to provide us with nutation and allow us to IR. So we've got this bias at mid stance. So again, now somebody is stuck at 90 degrees of hip flexion. We know we can bias a little bit more of an earlier phase of mid stance. And that is based on our shin angle and our center of mass distribution. We then conclude by saying that 120 to 180, which 180 is basically bringing your knee towards your chest in a non-compensatory way. And what I mean by that is, we'll talk about in a second, but knee deviating out to the side, for example, or hip rolling around. This is when we have the spine is able to rotate towards that side. So for example, if I am in heel strike on one side, toe off on the other. So toe off here, you can see how my spine and my sacrum turns towards the other side. So now I've got this heel strike position where I've got the spine is able to turn towards that side. Because remember, we've only got 120 degrees of hip flexion. So where does the rest come from? The spine turning that way. I have the ability to reduce concentric activity of these lower lumbar muscles. So this provides me with the indication, okay, well, if I get to 120, I've got the pelvic motion, but I don't have the lumbar spine that is able to turn side to side or side bend side to side. Again, how much motion is happening in the lumbar spine? Very marginal. There shouldn't be a lot of rotation in the lumbar spine, but there should be some relaxation of tissues in order to allow for the pelvis to roll toward that side, to re-counter nutate. This is when my center of mass is behind me and I'm able to unweight or unload my pelvis to allow for the tissues to relax. So I want to provide a little bit of a diagram to indicate the important divisions of the pelvis. Okay, so I'm just going to cover up, it just says important pelvic divisions. I'm going to cover up here just so you can see a little bit more. But what I like to do is divide the pelvis into, again, 3 phases, because at each section, we have different muscle contractility happening. And because of that, that allows us to indicate, okay, well, if I get to only 60 degrees of hip flexion, I know that this lower part of the pelvis is being squeezed, it's being compressed. I know if I can't get to 120 or I can't get above 120, I know we've got to open up this upper part of the sacrum a little bit, this upper part or the lower part of the lumbar spine to allow that pelvis to turn. So the upper part of the pelvis, which in anatomical terms is called the sacral base. This is from L4 to S1. So this is, think of the red line to the blue line. This area here allows us to get end range hip flexion, as I mentioned. It allows us to get counter nutation, which again is just the tailbone tucking under so that lumbar spine can flex. Okay, if we have extension, there's no rotation happening. If we've got flexion, we have the ability to turn our pelvis to that side. So we turn towards flexion away from internal rotation. So we've got counter nutation and external rotation of the innominates. Once we move down a layer, so now we look at between the blue and the green. This is going to be anywhere from S1 to S4 or S5. Okay, so basically just above where the coccyx meets the sacrum. This is what we're looking at when we're talking about the pelvis or talking about mid stance. Okay, so we've got muscles. When we talk about internal rotation, that is a compression happening at the back of the sacrum, right? So I'll take my fingers and pretend like they're muscles. There's compression happening back here to push that forward. Think of this as the multifidus. The multifidus will attach right down here and it will contract to push the sacrum forward. That allows for IR of the hips. and a closing of the top of the pelvis. This needs to happen at this internal rotation phase, and we're going to call it 60 to 120, and they're not exact, but let's just, for simplicity's sake, for a model standpoint, 60 to 120 is great. This is when we internally rotate the hip. So think of, if you get to 90 degrees, we are looking at, can this space be open, this space down here? Can we nutate? Can we internally rotate the hips? Then we go into the lower pelvis. Lower pelvis, again, S5, S4 down towards this trochanter. So like the upper part of the femur, okay? These muscles down here, we got to think about our hamstrings, we got to think about our adductors, right? We also got to think about, in the front side, we've got upper part of our quads, we've got our hip flexors, our TFL, like all these are going to be contributors to that. And so this is also the area that's occupied by the pelvic floor. Many don't realize this, but the pelvic floor is attached to the tip of the coccyx, and it goes through or to the front of the pelvis. It's like a little hammock at the bottom of the pelvis. It doesn't go up here. It's not up there. It's right at the bottom of the pelvis, and it will attach to these sit bones as well. And it will close or open the pelvic floor or pelvis depending on the contractility of that muscle. And that muscle is a diaphragm, and diaphragms are pressure regulators. So when we are creating a lot of pressure in the pelvis, depending on the phase of gait, that is either going to contract or eccentrically orient, or not, I don't like to use the word relax because the muscles are never relaxed, but let's just say they lengthen or they relax, just for, again, simplicity. And that will change the shape of the pelvis. And again, so what this is going to indicate is, if I have compression down here, just like the upper body, I am not going to be able to get those early ranges of hip flexion. I'm not going to be able to get into this area very well. I'm going to hit a wall pretty early because of that muscle tension. So we got to think, this green line below, this is our toe off. This red line, so this blue line to green line, that is our mid stance. And then from our red line to the blue line, that is our heel strike. So at each different phase, we're able to manipulate where we want to influence the pelvis and the structures. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about the mobility checkpoints or the assessment. Okay, so I'm going to make my camera a little bit slower. So with this, these are going to be the two measurements that we're going to be using as our KPI, or key performance indicator, in order to differentiate where we are going to be moving through the phases. During COVID, I was assessing a lot of clients virtually. And what I was finding is, when I was trying to get these measurements so I can make decisions on what to do, I had a very hard time preventing them from cheating or getting a result that wasn't true, because they were rolling too much, they were lifting up their legs. And so what I decided to do is to put their feet against the wall and press into the wall a little bit, because when I flex the hip, for example, what I want is, I want the bottom leg to be extended or straight as that leg flexes. If the bottom leg cannot stay extended, then that means that that hip is going to be flexed. That pelvis is going to be more forward. So I don't have the ability to internally rotate that side, because what I need is, I need one side to flex, one side to extend. That is what gait. That's what happens with gait. I need one side to push me forward as the other side is swinging in the air. So it provided me with a good reliability measurement. So I would encourage you to do this when you're assessing yourself through these checkpoints. So what we're going to be looking at here is, we're going to be looking at the hip flexion. So what I'd like you to do, lay on your back with feeling equal parts on your pelvis. I don't want you to force your back into the ground. There should be no muscle activity. You should be super relaxed, pressing your feet into the wall. Okay. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of a lip here, so I couldn't get my heel on, but ideally, like, you have your foot totally flat against the wall. Then what you're going to do is you're going to march one knee up towards your chest. Now, what I like to cue clients is press into the wall with the bottom leg, and you're going to march this knee up very relaxed, and you're going to aim your knee towards your nose. I don't want it to go towards the shoulder because that's compensating. I want you to stop whenever you feel tension or a struggle in the movement. You shouldn't be forcing it. And I also want you to stop if you feel this leg starts to lift up or your back starts to roll into the ground, or you can't keep your knee inwards anymore. There's too much of a pinch. If there's a pinch going on, I want you to stop and mark that down and say, okay, well, I got to 90 degrees, but I had a pinch in the front of the hip, or I had some muscle tension in the front of the hip, knock down 10 degrees. So in that case, you'd be measuring at 80. Okay. So you're going to come up and you're going to measure how far you get. If you get to 120 clear, then what I'm going to get you to do is get into the position. See, this is about 90, right? But you can see how my leg starts to lift up. So I would say it's probably a little bit less. See, right about there. Right about there. Or maybe a little bit higher, maybe like 60 or 70. But once we get to 120, which is your knee is in line with the lower part of your rib cage, then what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to hug your knee towards your chest. And I want you to see, could you get your knee towards your chest? Again, not too much effort, very light. And then that is going to indicate that we need to work on changing the lumbar spine or turning the lumbar spine, which is going to be in the later phases of the program, right? So for me, I definitely need to start in the early part of the program. And then once I can get to 90 clear, I'll go to the second phase and then I'll go to the third phase. But what I recommend for everybody, do not skip phases. A lot of people need to focus on the basics. We should go through the program regardless of your level of activity, regardless of the amount of mobility that you have or believe you have. Start at phase one. I promise you it is going to provide the most benefit. Okay, so lay on your back, feet against the wall. You're going to march one knee towards your chest, aiming the knee towards the nose. You're going to press the bottom leg into the ground. You're going to stop whenever you feel tension in the front of the hip, the bottom leg lifting. You can't put any more pressure into the wall, or you feel your back rolling. Okay. We talk about the straight leg raise. The straight leg raise is going to indicate that we have this space open or closed. So is this bottom part closed or is it open? It's going to be a lot more of an internal rotation measurement, but I like to again divide it into 3 different phases. Okay. So just like the pelvis, right? When we start to look at the straight leg raise, same cues apply. Okay. We got our foot straight against the wall. We have equal parts of our pelvis against the ground. We now are not bending the knee. We're locking out the knee and we're going to lift the leg up. I also prefer you to flex your ankle. That is going to make sure that we don't have any tension going through the back of the hip that could be restricting. If I were to point my toes, that would take some slack out of the tissue or out of the hamstrings or out of the lower part of the pelvis. And that could be a fake measurement. So same cues. We've got the heel pressed. We've got the foot in line with the nose. And then you're going to lift. Okay, so I'll just let you see this. You're going to go up and down, nice and slow. Stop whenever you feel tension. Stop if you feel like the pelvis is rolling. And stop if you can't put any pressure into the ground. So you can see, and I'm over exaggerating some of this. You can see how my leg's lifting. Like this is me rolling backwards. That's not good. So I'm done about right there in that case. Then I keep on going higher, and that is fake. So I don't want you looking at this and saying, oh, I've got 60 degrees. When really, I'm probably at about 40 or 30, okay? So this is why it's important to be diligent with how we're measuring so we can get the most effective results, okay? Each phase is going to encompass the different ranges of straight leg raise and hip flexion, just like we've outlined in the past. So with the straight leg raise, 0 to 45, that's your toe off. In the hip flexion, 0 to 60, that's your toe off. For the straight leg raise, 50 to about 70, that is your mid stance. For your hip flexion, 60 to 120, that's your mid stance. When we get to heel strike, that is 70 to 90 when it comes to the straight leg raise. And for the hip flexion, it is going to be 120 to 180. Now, some people may say, well, what if I'm hypermobile or I have a lot of mobility? Don't be deceived. It's probably an indication that your center of gravity is so far forward that you've loosened up some of the capsule to change the position of your joints. And that is how we're achieving this grandiose or this great range of motion. What we need to do is we still need to go through the phases, but you're probably gonna have to focus a lot more on that second phase, that build phase, which focuses on internally rotating everything. So let's recap a little bit of the resilient lower framework, okay? We're gonna talk about the different phases now. So we've broken them down to 3 different phases. Again, the way that I have organized this program is I thought about the stiffest people I've worked with and how I would rebuild them from the ground up, so to say, okay? And we need to master the fundamentals. And that's why we're starting with the foundation phase, where we're assuming everybody is starting at toe off. And I want you to assume that yourself is also starting at the most limited, regardless of if you've got more or not, because we're still going to have benefits mastering those fundamental, those basics. Okay. So the intention here of this foundation phase is to improve the initial ranges of motion so that we can alleviate any compensatory patterns. So any compensations that may occur, and it happens with a lot of people, especially those who are trained, because they lift a lot of weight, they moved around a lot, they've repeatedly stressed their body in one way. And with that stress creates compensations and adaptations, which could be good for the sport that you're playing, but it's also important to really open up our ability to express range of motion in different environments as well. So our foundation phase is really how can we drive external rotation throughout the system. Then we go into our phase 2. So we do our mobility checkpoint or assessment checkpoint. We assess, we're like, okay, great. We've passed 60, we're at about 90 now. Now with hip flexion, you're not gonna be able to feel 60, but let's just say anything below 90, just make it easy. So we get to about 90 degrees of hip flexion now. We've got a straight leg raise, 45 to 70. We're doing pretty well. We've made some good changes in the first phase. Now we move into the build phase. This is when we start to build a little bit more strength and we start to really focus on the force production aspect of gait, that mid stance, that pronation, that internal rotation. That sticking point that we're always told about was the hardest part of the motion, because that is where we need to produce force. That is when we need to internally rotate. That is when people will cave their knees in. They will dump their whole foot in because they cannot manage that internal rotation force. So we're driving IR through the whole system. Then we move into the resilient phase, the third phase, the final phase, where we now have good range of motion. We're at 120. We're 70 degrees of straight leg raise, and now we need to improve end range of motion. We need to superimpose force and power production on top of the mobility that we have. So now we can start to increase speed, increase velocity, but not sacrifice our movement. We can also regain the last ranges of motion of our movement, our deep hip flexion now. Now we're in our deep hip flexion and our hinging movements where we can express more range of motion. So a lot of questions I get is, how do we integrate this with the upper body program? Again, as I mentioned, they're intended to parallel or mirror with each other. And they have similar underpinnings. They have similar foundational elements that have been put into to create this program. So in the upper body programs, we based on the shoulder flexion arc. In the lower body, it's gonna be more a hip flexion. But the shoulder and the hip, as I mentioned, there's a lot of similarities between them. So we can use these simultaneously. So one day you can do your upper body day. Next day you can do your lower body day. And what you can do is, or what Yeah, you can alternate them, or you can combine them together if you can. But ideally, we do them on alternating days just for this program. And now we can drive similar adaptations to ensure that we have restored the motion and developed more resilient body in the upper and the lower body, because we need them to progress with each other, because the pelvis is going to influence the upper body and the upper body is going to influence the pelvis. So that's why we need to integrate both of them together. So with that, I want to welcome you again to the Resilient Body series. I look forward to hearing about your progress. Please feel free to post your progress on Instagram, tag me in it. I will reshare it. My goal for this is to get this to as many people as possible, because I have a lot of clients who have benefited from this. A lot of people that I know who have used these principles have really gained success when it comes to pain, movement, strains of tissues, although that's not really a good word to use, but injury prevention, to gain access to mobility and stability that you don't have. And so I want to help as many people as I can. And the way to do that is with your help in sharing your own progress. So I look forward to hearing about your progress and how you move through the program. And if you haven't already, on the PDF, there is a Facebook link. Join the Facebook group and we're going to continue discussion. And I look forward to interacting with you more. And thank you so much.